flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In May of 1945, as Allied nations celebrated VE Day, millions of refugees were spread across Europe. These refugees were soon classified as displaced persons, or DPs. Resettling the thousands of Jewish Holocaust survivors within the DP population proved to be a unique challenge for the Allies. The Jewish DPs encountered a series of triumphs and tragedies throughout the post-war era. Jewish DPs who sought refuge in Palestine were blocked by the conflict over the establishment of the State of Israel. At the same time, immigration quotas created obstacles to resettlement in the United States. Ultimately, diplomatic and domestic policy triumphs allowed Jewish DPs to find new homes in both Israel and the United States. For the Allies, the joy over their victory in Europe was soon tempered by the need to address the tragedy of 7 million DPs throughout Europe. Between May and September of 1945, the Americans, British, and new United Nations addressed the problem by establishing temporary displaced persons camps throughout Western Europe. The goal was to eventually repatriate these people to their former homelands. Unfortunately, the devastation of the Holocaust and lingering anti-Semitism throughout Europe made repatriation difficult.
So in Poland was no space for us anymore, only a cemetery with my ancestors living there.
As the resettlement question dragged on, Jews faced harsh conditions in the DP camps and organized themselves to resist repatriation. In August 1945, President Truman commissioned Earl Harrison, the American envoy to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, to conduct an evaluation of the DP camps. Particular attention was to be given to the problems, needs, and views of the Jewish refugees among the displaced population. The report concluded that we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers, under our military guard instead of SS troops. The Harrison report also made several recommendations.
Paramount among these recommendations were first and foremost to house the Jewish DPs in separate camps. So in many cases you had survivors who were forced to live in camps with former collaborators, people who had not long ago been their persecutors.
The report also called for 100,000 Jewish DPs to be allowed entry into Palestine. By September 1945, the majority of the non-Jewish DPs had been repatriated to their former homelands, leaving 250,000 Jews in the DP camps. While there were several options for relocation of the Jewish DPs, the Allies soon found themselves in a diplomatic struggle over resettlement in Palestine or the United States. Within the Jewish DP camps, support grew for connecting resettlement to the Zionist movement. Prominent Zionist leaders visited the camps, urging Jewish DPs to transform the Jewish tragedy from a sea of tears and blood into a form of revolutionary strength. The Brihah movement, set up to illegally transport 100,000 DPs to Palestine, soon emerged. The influx of Jewish immigrants into Palestine tragically exacerbated growing tensions with the resident Palestinians. The British, who governed the territory, rejected U.S. calls to allow 100,000 DPs into Palestine. A British newspaper, the New Statesman and Nation, commented that America's request would be more impressive had she opened her doors wide to Hitler's victims. Unable to effectively stem the flow of the incoming Jewish immigrants, Britain referred the situation to the United Nations. Despite widespread Arab opposition, the UN established the Jewish State of Israel in May of 1948. Many DPs resettled in Israel, while others sought refuge in the United States, rather than face the risks of the growing Arab-Israeli conflict. The legacy of 1920s immigration quotas severely restricted the number and origin of European immigrants into the United States. Reform of U.S. immigration policy began on June 25, 1948, when President Truman signed the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed the entry of 205,000 European refugees into the U.S. But he only did so with great concern about its restrictive provisions. He noted that the bad points of the bill form a pattern of discrimination and intolerance, wholly inconsistent with the American sense of justice. The bill discriminates against displaced persons of the Jewish faith. The language of the bill excluded more than 90% of Jewish DPs. Senator Pat McCarran led a minority of congressmen who sought to keep strict immigration policies. McCarran stated that too many DPs entering the country are active subversives who have no other purpose than to undermine our American way of life. He claimed that these DPs would bring pro-communist ideals with them to the U.S., even though many of them were actually trying to escape repatriation to Soviet states. In 1950, Congress amended the 1948 Act and corrected the discrimination inherent in the previous act. The tragedy of discriminatory legislation was ended with a triumph for humanitarianism. A key provision of the 1948 Act was the establishment of the Federal Commission on Displaced Persons. The formation of the commission was a triumph in U.S. immigration history, since it was the first refugee resettlement agency established by the federal government. 36 state commissions were also established to coordinate resettlement issues at the local level. State commissions served as information centers and oversaw the procedures of voluntary agencies such as the Church World Service, National Lutheran Council, and Jewish Family Services. These agencies coordinated the sponsorship, transportation, reception, and resettlement of the DP immigrants. For example, Minnesota absorbed approximately 6,780 DPs.
And they told us no. They said, for you the best thing is to come to the United States. They had a job lined up for me. If you don't like the job, you can get another job. Just come to the United States.
It was hard to get used to make friends, and first of all to learn the language. But we are very lucky that we came to the United States and found a home where to raise our family and to live among nice people.
The resettlement of DPs into Minnesota reflected similar triumphs in other states. A study of the passengers from the first DP ship that came to the U.S., the General Black, found that 10 years later, almost all were citizens, employed, and regarded themselves as financially secure. They had triumphed over adversity to become members of a community where they could contribute and belong. The last DP camp in Europe was closed on February 28, 1957. By this time, 136,000 Jewish DPs had immigrated to Israel, while 80,000 Jewish DPs, among a total of 400,000 European DPs, had come to the United States.
Israel was hard. The situation was very critical. But then our relatives here suggested that we come to the United States, and somehow we preferred the United States.
The creation of the State of Israel fulfilled the Jewish dream of a homeland in Palestine, but also resulted in ongoing conflicts with Palestinians and Arab states that continue to this day. For the United States, the resolution of the displaced persons tragedy in Europe set precedents for future refugee policy. In 1953, Congress passed another Emergency Refugee Act that admitted 214,000 people fleeing communism in Europe. Legislation like this would later benefit refugees from Hungary, Cuba, Vietnam, and many other countries. In 1945, the Allies and United Nations faced the crucial issue of recovery from the tragic effects of World War II and the Holocaust in Europe. The resettlement of the Jewish DPs was complicated by post-war diplomatic tensions and restrictive immigration policies. Ultimately, many DPs became part of the new Jewish homeland in Israel, while others took advantage of American immigration reform and resettled in the U.S. In both places, the Jewish DPs found new homes, a new start on life, and triumph over adversity.